We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View. And in about a half an hour, we're going to be talking with William Barclay about the idea of populism and political violence and the rest. I think you'll appreciate that conversation. Then we'll get into some other issues in the news. And, of course, second hour, we'll cover many more of those issues because there is a lot to cover. And we will certainly try to pick up as many pieces as we can today. If not, we'll postpone some of them to Friday because we'll have our roundtable, which will include Jeff Mateer as well as Keisha Russell. One of those that we might have covered tomorrow is probably worth covering right now today. And the reason for that is yesterday there was a meeting of a very important organization, and it relates to many of the conversations we have about religious liberty. And it was the inaugural meeting of the task force put together by President Donald Trump, and it's called the Task Force to Eradicate Anti-Christian Bias in the Federal Government. As a matter of fact, there was a very good press release that came out from our friends at First Liberty, which is why I thought we might talk about it tomorrow. But now, in light of some of the very important issues that have come before the Supreme Court, some of their very important cases, we might not give it the kind of attention I think it deserves right here. And I think it deserves attention because we talk about religious liberty, and yet if you go out on the internet and you go and watch television programs and listen to radio programs, you wouldn't even know that that meeting took place yesterday. Legacy media didn't cover that. Not surprised there. Conservative media, as far as I can tell, never covered it. I'm not even sure Christian media did. And I certainly could pull together some pieces, but I think the best summary comes from our good friend Gary Bauer, who yesterday, to his credit, did publish this and talked about the fact that this meeting was one in which the president wanted to root out some of the anti-Christian bias in the federal government. He begins his section after some initial and introductory comments by saying anyone getting their news from the left-wing mainstream media might be surprised to learn that there is even an anti-Christian bias in the government. And so he gives us three examples. He says, how else can you explain the Biden administration telling chaplains they cannot give overtly Christian sermons at veterans hospitals? I'll come back to that in just a minute. Number two, what about the FBI under the Biden administration that spied on conservative churches, in some respects because some of the activists said that traditional Catholics were potential domestic extremists? That's not Gary Bauer's words. That's what you can find in some of the documents. And the third example he gives is the Biden administration also ordered the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy to remove this iconic painting of Jesus Christ that had been prominently displayed for more than 70 years. I might just mention, we reported just the other day that it was brought up from the basement and posted again. Anyway, Gary Bauer goes on to say that under the leadership of the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, President Trump's task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias in the federal government met yesterday, which would be actually Tuesday, and heard from three witnesses. We'll talk about each one of those. The first one is very familiar to you. It is Michael Farris, who is the attorney who has worked with Alliance Defending Freedom, before that with the Homeschool Legal Defense, and described how the Biden IRS targeted Pastor Gary Hamrick and the Cornerstone Church for alleged violations of the so-called Johnston Amendment, which has been, of course, used over the years, as we've talked about, to muzzle conservative pastors. One of the other speakers was Dr. Scott Hicks. He is the provost of Liberty University, and explained how the Biden administration slammed Liberty with the largest fines in history, while at the same time ignoring the anti-Semitism on many of these so-called, as he said, institutions of higher education. And then the third person is somebody that we've mentioned because he actually was a client of First Liberty. He was one of the several Navy special warfare officers who, because of his religious convictions about the COVID vaccine, was kicked out of the Navy. And so you have those three individuals from very different areas talking about some of the things that have taken place. Gary Bauer just goes on to point out then you had some cabinet members that serve in the Trump cabinet who also are part of the task force, and they offered some examples, so let me give you all three of those. Number one was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, former, of course, senator from Florida, who reported that Christian employees at the State Department were threatened with child abuse investigations because they wanted to homeschool their children. I'm not making this up. Number two, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, that would be Robert F. Kennedy Jr., reported that the Biden administration implemented new rules making it harder for Christians to become foster parents. And we've reported some of that as well. And then finally, number three, Secretary of Education Linda McMahon reported that Christian teachers had been fired for resisting radical LGBTQ ideology and for respecting parental rights. If you listened yesterday, you know we talked about this case that is before the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were just the other day, and we'll see how that comes down. But I think we will certainly see a win in that regard. And so Gary Bauer kind of ends by saying this. There are just a few, and these are just a few of the many examples of anti-Christian bias that were exposed at yesterday's meeting. They highlight the epidemic of anti-Christian bias throughout the federal government's left-wing bureaucracy. And he goes on to acknowledge that President Trump is doing what no Republican president, let alone any Democratic president, has dared to do. He's boldly defending the rights of Christians and rooting out militant secularism in the federal government. So, again, this was not something that was well covered. You can certainly go to the Wednesday edition of Gary Bauer on American values. You can just go to Our American Values and see it. You could go to our friends First Liberty Institute. I do want to get some of their comments tomorrow about that as well. And at that meeting, when we were talking about veterans, real quickly, let me just mention now that the new Secretary of Veterans Affairs, that would be Doug Collins, former member of Congress, explained his actions in the department to stop the unconstitutional speech code at the medical center. The Secretary's actions came after he received a letter, of course, from our friends at First Liberty that brought attention to one of those individuals, a chaplain, who took a stand when facility administrators attempted to punish him for a chapel message. Again, it is amazing to me that when you hire a chaplain or you have a chaplain in the military, and then you expect the chaplain not to use a biblical text and not to preach on a biblical text, it sort of strains credulity. But nevertheless, that is the world we find ourselves in. And the good news is, I think, again, we are winning more and more of these religious liberty cases. And let's give credit where credit is due. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, you got to give him credit. Putting together a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias in the federal government. Has there been anyone else doing that? And it is pretty amazing that he has done that. Well, that's a break we're going to take right now. We've got some other things to cover. A little bit later, we're going to have William Barclay with us. He is one of the individuals. He's a contributor, Young Voices, but has written a very good piece on populism and just the lack of civility and political discourse. But before we get to that, let me cover just a couple other issues that you might need to know about. Some of which have been covered, some of which have been ignored. But we won't ignore them right here on Point of View. I'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
16 years ago, I wrote the book Making the Most of Your Money on Tough Times, and I tried to cover all the important issues connected with money, including a chapter on materialism and consumerism. But it didn't occur to me to write about the group of Americans now referred to as the Henrys. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal, many Americans qualify as Henry, which stands for high earner, not rich yet. These are people who have incomes in the hundreds of thousands who still are living paycheck to paycheck. These Henrys describe feeling stuck on a hamster wheel, a nice one that other hamsters envy, but running in place nonetheless. Of course, the natural reaction is, you're asking me to feel sympathy for Audi driving, Chase Sapphire loving, Whole Foods shopping consultant types with kids in private school? Well, maybe not. But Henrys represent at the high end what most Americans are feeling. This is the growing gap between what you have and what you feel you need to be comfortable. Their anxiety illustrates two theological principles. First, most Americans lack contentment. Paul explained that he has learned in whatever situation I am to be content. We are seeking happiness, which is often elusive. Our discontentment arises from trying to fill a God-shaped vacuum in our soul with material goods. Second, this discontentment is connected to a lack of meaning and identity. We need purpose, or more accurately, we need to follow God's calling in our lives. Paul said he was going to press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Too many Americans are looking for meaning, identity, and happiness in the wrong places and need to find contentment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
First article that we have today is entitled, "It's Not Just a Population Crisis." It's not posted on the website yet, but I think if you check back later, you can find it, or you can actually just look for it out on the internet. It's written by Tom Knighton, and it brings us to an issue that Penna Dexter has written about a great deal. I've written about it as well. Recently, someone asked, of all things, Elon Musk, what is the biggest existential crisis you think we face in the 21st century? And after a long pause, he's known for those long pauses, he talked about the fact we're not having babies. And the implication is we're facing a population crisis. And after I decided to post this, then last night I saw the news about how Donald Trump was asked about this idea of providing $5,000 as a baby bonus to new mothers, which, of course, has gotten some real pushback. And quite frankly, I'm not sure it will be that effective. We are running into a problem where we had a baby boom and then a baby bust, and now we're in kind of a birth dearth, and we are not replacing our population. That's the argument usually given to us for why we should have more immigrants. But this isn't just a problem here. It's a problem in almost every industrialized country in the world. I'm aware of attempts to try to come up with benefits or bonuses. Russia's tried that. I've been in Hungary where I actually talked with a couple, which I think have a better idea there if you want to do something like this, where a couple that has children receive a loan. And then if they do a certain number of things, the loan is forgiven, so it becomes a gift. And so there are some things to do, but there is not only a population crisis, but as Tom Knighton points out, you really have to go upstream. We're not having babies because people aren't getting married, and people aren't getting married because they aren't dating as much. So you have to sort of go upstream there. And by the way, some of you might say, I wouldn't necessarily agree there's a population crisis. We, maybe in your nursery, in your church, are jammed. And that gets to another thing we've talked about here on Point of View, and that is, yes, there is a decline in population in America and Europe and all sorts of other places, but there's not only a fertility drop, there's a fertility gap. That is, Christians have more babies than non-Christians. Conservatives have more babies than liberals. And so this fertility gap, which is growing each year, when I first wrote about it, the fertility gap was like at 47%. It's even more pronounced as well, because at least within the churches, at least some couples hear about the fact that children are a gift from God. They're arrows in your quiver. We have some very positive things about children. We have baby dedications and the rest. But let's get back to this population crisis, because it was kind of interesting, because he says, as people talk about the issues of depopulation, they look to government programs to solve the issue. This is something I don't like just on principle, but I admit there are times such programs might be beneficial. But he says the real problem is it misses the bigger problem. People aren't having as many children, but that's not really the issue. It's a symptom of the issue, because he says children, you see, are the end result of a series of decisions made by men and women, and the way society suggests people make those decisions has ramifications that go well beyond the short-term ramifications people see. People aren't having kids because they're not getting married, gives a reference to that you can follow. And then number two, they're not getting married because dating is a lot harder, and then points to some of those issues as well. So he says, first, let's talk about warped ideas. He goes into the 666 rule. I won't go into all the details there, but without going into some of that, it's an illustration that if women are looking for men, for example, 6 feet tall, have a six-figure income, we won't even look at some of the others, that's 3% of the American male population. So that kind of narrows it down pretty quickly if that's kind of the superficial way you choose a potential husband and father. But then he goes on to say men aren't blameless in this either, because a lot of women aren't that superficial. They're open to dating guys. The problem is men don't approach them anymore. And then this gives me an opportunity to finally say something critical about Andrew Tate. I saw somebody recently saying, people aren't speaking out enough about Andrew Tate, so we will right now. If you're not familiar with Andrew Tate, look it up. But again, Andrew Tate telling guys that to be an alpha male, you need to be an insufferable jerk, grind culture, all that, and on and on and on. No, we are all against some of the things that he has been telling men for some time. But the other part of this is that if you're a woman looking for a potential husband, potential father, there's another issue, not only how tall they are, whether they're a good provider, but education. Again, it is certainly possible to be married either to a man who's more educated than a woman or a woman more educated than a man. But if you would like to have someone who has a comparable level of education, there's another problem, because I remember years ago when Penna Dexter and I first did programs together when Marlon Maddox was the host, Penna would sometimes talk about the feminist issues. And even at the time I said, Penna, if you start thinking about this, already we see feminists and women talking about how they're being affected negatively by the culture. But if you're really honest about this, already at that time, even in the 1990s and of course in the 2000s, women were graduating from high school at a higher percentage than men. Women were graduating from college at a higher percentage than men, all sorts of other things. And of course, that skews, if you will, the dating pool. So nevertheless, it's a very interesting article. I've summarized it quickly because I wanted to get to some other issues, but simply say, when we sometimes talk about a population crisis, you need to go upstream a little bit and recognize we're not having babies because we're not getting married, and we're not getting married because we're not necessarily even dating. And there are cultural issues associated with that, and they're not going to be easily resolved with political programs. But as I've said before, at the very least, we could make sure that we do no harm. For a long time in our tax code, we've had what was called a marriage penalty, and we certainly have some other, if you will, penalties penalties against having children and the rest. And so we can do some things to at least alleviate the pressure. But not only are people not getting married, they're actually not working either, which brings me to one of my more frequent commentaries. And this one comes from our good friend Mike Rowe. Mike Rowe was, of course, you know him as the host of Dirty Jobs, and he was on the Theo Von show the other day, and in which he was saying what we've been saying, and I've been saying now for a couple of weeks, and that is we have the possibility, because of all the things Donald Trump is doing, whether he keeps the tariffs on indefinitely or uses those as a negotiating strategy to change things, we could indeed be bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States. And what Mike Rowe mentioned on the Theo Von show is that we already have unfilled jobs in the manufacturing industry. He said that if indeed Trump brings manufacturing back and has reinvigorated the country, then there's going to be a challenge that a lot of people aren't talking about, and that's the challenge of labor. By the way, let's give us some credit here. We have been talking about that. In January, there are 482,000 open positions in manufacturing in the country. And if you start thinking about that, by bringing some of these industries back, you're talking about creating another 2 million, maybe another 3 million new jobs. And there's really no workforce out there at the moment sitting there ready to go. So he talks about the fact that the skilled labor force has really faced a significant shortage for some time. And, of course, then he points out the fact that we've had this stigma about choosing vocational school over attending a four-year college. And he even talks about the fact that for many years, as we've talked about here as well, we took shop class out of high school and we robbed, as he said, kids of the opportunity to even see what kind of work even looks like. And then we've told a whole generation of kids that they're going to be, he uses a word I wouldn't use on the air, if they don't get a four-year degree. And so again, as he points out, we have 6.8 million able-bodied men not looking for work. They're not working and they're not looking for work. So once again, we had some very significant statements being made, in this case, in a podcast with Mike Rowe. But Mike Rowe is saying some of the things that we've quoted on some of my commentaries and mentioned on the air. If indeed we're going to bring manufacturing back, we've got to change the attitudes that we have here. We have a skills gap, but we also have a will gap, and we need to really address those significantly. And both of these commentaries, I think, illustrate that some of the solutions to the problems we're facing right now aren't going to be resolved in the political arena. They're going to be resolved in the cultural arena. That's why we certainly believe that's another area that Point of View needs to talk about. And we will continue to do so. Let's take a break, though. We're going to talk about this idea of populism and popular culture. All that coming up right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to be talking about this issue of populism. Might just hold up this booklet that I did a while back on historical cycles. We got talking about populism in that booklet. And of course, we can get into this in some detail. It also pulls together this desire that we have for civility and a true civil discourse. So this particular article, which I think you're going to find very helpful on our website at pointofview.net, is one that you can look up. It comes from Real Clear Politics. And I believe in just a few minutes we'll have some of those articles posted on the website. So once that is available, you can find that as well. And I think you will also appreciate just the conversation we're going to have now with William Barclay. He is a political theorist, a private consultant, an individual that is one of the contributors to Young Voices. And you know, many of those individuals have joined our Millennial Roundtable. And I think that would be something we might be able to do with him in the future. He's also been able to participate in a lot of discourse about human rights issues and the rest. We have his full bio there as well. But first of all, William, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'd love to get to know you a little better. I have only found your article here. We read it. We have posted it, or will post it on the website as soon as our individual gets involved in getting all that up there. But I just think you've been involved in this space for some time and have noticed a real degradation in any kind of true civil discourse, haven't you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In America, it's been astonishing for me. I mean, especially given that for centuries, America has been hailed as kind of this paragon of pluralism and free speech. Just this deterioration that has occurred in U.S. society has been atrocious. I think kind of post-2016, we've had the American media consistently kind of label everything or everyone who doesn't worship at the altar of liberalism and leftist ideology as a populist, and kind of use that as the impetus to really violate their human rights and exclude them from everything we view to be as quintessentially American.
You know, one of the things I talk about is this is not just an American issue, because I'll see what you define, how you define populism, but my definition would say you can't really understand the Brexit movement in Europe without understanding populism, or the Yellow Jackets protest in France, maybe even the farmer protest in the Netherlands. Obviously, the election of Donald Trump in 2016 is something that happened in America, but let's just make sure we're working on the same definition. When you talk about populism, it is something that is almost now given a negative connotation, but throughout American history, whether you look where you are in Canada or where we are in the United States, that has oftentimes been really kind of the foundation of a lot of political movements in the North American continent, hasn't it?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I think, like, for instance, populism and democracy are really pretty much the same thing. I think they've been fundamentally misconstrued over the past decade. As diametrically opposed or oppositional in some way, and they're simply not. I think that left-wing pundits and politicians have kind of invoked this ghoul of populism in order to frighten and shame people away from the right wing of the political spectrum. I think at best, nowadays at least, populism is merely kind of a moniker that left-wing politicians have attached to any unwanted political outcomes or conservative results, you know, in an effort to really ignore the real needs of the state and the bedrock of any democracy, it's people.
Let's see, we can maybe talk about populism in one sense, the elites versus the people, because if you look at how some of the reaction, it's been in America, this sense that, well, a few of the so-called expert class aren't so expert. The elitists aren't thinking about what's happening to the day-to-day people. Over in Europe, it's, well, we don't necessarily believe that the European Union's always doing the best thing for what's happening in our country, and we certainly are not convinced that the International Monetary Fund or the World Health Organization or the World Economic Forum or any of these are necessarily going to advance my interests. So is some of it populism a reaction to elitists saying, we know what's best for you and we're going to try to tell you how to run your life?
Oh, I think in a lot of ways. I think that in a lot of ways, populism really first appeared post-2016 and the election of Donald Trump in a lot of mainstream media in the USA, at least. Kind of post, like I think 2016 and the American people's rejection of Hillary Clinton and what was the political status quo. I think that if you look at the political discourse that dominated the modern era, populism has been contrasted with globalism and how do you say, progressive politics, right? Nationalism and globalism have been this pair, populism and progressivism have been this pair, and they've been very much misconstrued as enemies or kind of set off against each other in order to divide people and prevent them from speaking or conversing, again, engaging in this earnest discourse.
Let's, if we can, talk about Canada. Of course, now you're going to have a new prime minister, but Justin Trudeau is one we can maybe beat up on for just a moment or two. And he's been championed, as you say in your article, as an individual that is promoting liberty and human rights. I think a lot of us looking at the way in which the truckers were treated, in which they were treated as if they were domestic terrorists, in which their bank accounts were actually suspended and the rest, they're probably, if you were to be honest and back away from your ideology for a minute, have to say that it was about as anti-democratic and anti-human rights as anything that people could have imagined right there in Canada.
Oh, yeah, and the Canadian courts agree with you. They found that Prime Minister Trudeau had actually violated the Canadian Constitution, or Charter of Rights and Freedoms, sorry. And that's, I think, something that people have allowed him to get off the hook with regards to. I think that the other thing is you have Justin Trudeau as being, like you're saying, trumpeted and championed as this paragon or this exemplar of human rights, when he has literally violated the charter rights of Canadians, whereas you have Donald Trump, who's, again, portrayed as this enemy or opponent of human rights and free speech, and he's done nothing but promote it. And I think that it's just, again, in a way, this intentional ignorance that's come to dominate political discourse in society, where the left is being held up as the paragon of virtue and all good, and the right-wing ideology as a whole has been misconstrued as evil.
Again, what I think surprised a lot of us, William, is we've always sort of thought of people in Canada as being just kind of nice and gentle, maybe not on in a hockey game, but everywhere else, that Canadians are just really nice people, and they really believe in free speech, and they really believe in pluralism, and they're very welcoming. But the way in which the Canadian truckers were treated, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of people who maybe hadn't thought that much about politics, but when it seemed like such a heavy-handed thing against those individuals, we began to say, is not Canada looking more like Cuba than it is like, say, the United States?
Oh, 100%. If you want some more kind of, let's say, totalitarian government fodder, our current Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is unelected in any capacity. He wasn't elected as an MP. He's never won a public election. He was an appointed Prime Minister. And I don't understand how the Canadian people have kind of let that slide. There should have been an immediate election. And again, we're supposed to be a democratic nation, but our Prime Minister is unelected. It's crazy to me. With regards to the truckers, I think one of the most atrocious or kind of grotesque things was that their rights were openly violated. And the fact that they were misconstrued as, again, populists or some kind of right-wing extremists was used as the impetus for that. We've seen echoes of this over in Europe again with Marine Le Pen very recently, actually. Who was barred from running for office for 5 years, and the judge explicitly stated that it was because of her serious and lasting attack on the rules of democratic life in Europe, and linked it, again, back to her populist politics. So we've seen human rights across the world violated and openly simply because they've been able to label and misconstrue the people as populists.
Wow. Well, let's talk about your Prime Minister for just another second, because that's something I wanted to educate our listeners about anyway. Mark Carney, first of all, was not elected. He's appointed, and even now you have to say some of those elections are questionable. But here's a man that was the governor, I think, of the Bank of England. To this day, I believe his wife lives more in New York City than in Canada, and all sorts of things. And so, again, that does make the case of the elitist versus the populist, doesn't it?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I think in terms of this globalist, elitist politician, he's much worse than Trudeau even. I think he's openly admitted it on video to being an elitist. And that's something that Trudeau certainly did many things with impunity, but that's something that I don't think he ever did quite so openly, maybe at the end of his era when he started to talk about Canada as a post-national state. But in terms of being a globalist vector, I think that Mark Carney is far worse than Trudeau in a lot of ways. And like you correctly highlighted, a lot of it ties into kind of his familial connections. I think his wife's aunt, actually, too, was the author of a particularly egregious social theory. I think it's the Coward Pivens or something like this theory. But I'll let your audience look into that themselves. It's really quite astonishing, kind of his globalist surrounding and roots.
Yes. Again, if you want to understand kind of how globalism is taking over some of these positions, I think Canada is a good example. I do need to take a break. I might just mention that we do have your article on Real Clear Politics. Of course, you can find it directly there, but I would encourage you to read it during the break. If you'd like to know a little bit more about William Barclay, we have that link there as well, because I think you would appreciate knowing a little bit more about them. We have, of course, his archive there of other articles he's written about everything from Gaza to populism generally and a number of other topics, as well as tariffs. So lots of great material. We'll come back and make a couple other comments. Let's open up the phones. Perhaps some of you have some comments about this. That number is 1-800-351-1212. We're talking about this issue of populism, political violence, and the collapse of civil discourse. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us for a few more minutes William Barclay, who again is a political theorist, private consultant, and an author of a number of very good articles that you can find on the website, including this one, Populism, Political Violence, and the Collapse of Civil Discourse. And William, for just a minute, I guess some people say, okay, you've talked about populism, but how does that affect the lack of civil discourse? And it kind of relates to, as my wife and I were walking this morning, somebody came up to me and said, well, I saw your commentary the other day about assassination culture, which was based on a survey which came out, which was entitled Assassination Culture, How Burning Teslas and Killing Billionaires Became a Meme Aesthetic for Political Violence. And in some respects, that overlaps with your commentary, which we've posted today, because the argument being made, and I'm kind of simplifying it a little bit, is that if you become more populist and less elitist, if you are more with the people and less with the experts, that means that you are not just wrong, but you are evil. And that then becomes a justification for attacking Tesla factories, dealerships, vehicles, attacking or trying to kill Donald Trump, Elon Musk. And it seems to me that that is also part and parcel of once the media starts attacking people that believe in populism, that becomes a justification for going after them in some pretty dramatic ways.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like you yourself just touched on, we've had President Trump be the victim of various assassination attempts during his campaign and during his time in office, and all of it's being justified under this moniker. This reason that he's a populist. We've seen human rights be precluded from politicians and people throughout Europe, and here in America itself. Like you were saying, Tesla owners had their property vandalized and destroyed. People were attacked. Factories, dealerships, and vehicles were being set ablaze. And the left kind of laughed at it and didn't really, say, confront it as vigorously as they would have if, let's say, these were, say, black-owned businesses. In fact, it was justified, again, under this weird kind of slant in American society nowadays that if you're a populist or the further right you go on the spectrum, the more evil you become, and the more left on the spectrum, the more progressive you become, the more good you become. And it's simply not true. I think, like you yourself touched on, there's this weird, comparison being set up between populists and experts. And I very much believe that populism itself is really not that different from democracy. I think they're very much the same thing. And so I think that populists are experts too. I think the American people are very good at judging what they want for themselves and making their own decisions. And I think that that's simply being discredited and thrown out the window by the left, who have been unable in a lot of ways to get over the rejection of Hillary Clinton in 2016.
I'm just thinking that it relates very much to something in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 5, it talks about people that call evil good and good evil. I mean, we're right now having people come up and saying, I don't understand any of this. How did Antifa become a good? How did Luigi Mangione, who assassinated a healthcare CEO in the street, become somebody that we should idolize and maybe have a T-shirt or candles honoring him? How is it that an MS-13 individual who probably, as we can now document, probably was also engaged in human trafficking and is a pretty disreputable individual, including how he even treated his wife, how he becomes the hero? There is a sense in which these values have been completely inverted, haven't they?
Oh, yeah, 100%. I think because there's been this false equivalency of everyone who doesn't worship at this altar of liberalism is being misconstrued as a populist. Populists have been misconstrued as fascists and Nazis, and ergo it's become acceptable to attack them. It's simply not true. I think in a lot of ways, you would find that whenever it comes to human rights, for instance, anyone who does espouse a right-wing ideology tends to be much more ardent in their defense of these human rights. And let's say the left, who, like you yourself pointed out just now, are willing to sacrifice the human rights of others for their own personal beliefs.
Let's, if I can, maybe take some phone calls, and I won't put you through too many of them, but we'll go up to Alaska first. Norman, thank you for joining our conversation today. I think you have a question.
Yes, wanted to find out, since Canada's our next door neighbor and we interact with Canada a lot, we wanted to know, is there any chance that Bernier from the People's Party has any chance in this election or a future one to get in as the real conservative for Canada versus Poilievre, who we have our doubts. Is he really a conservative as he speaks? I mean, we know he's against Trudeau as he spoke, but that's the first part. And then because of the economics of the whole Canada, if Carney does get in, does Alberta have any chance of seceding from Canada?
You got some good questions there. So, William, give us an answer if you can.
Well, so with regards to Bernier's chances, I'd say that they're slim to none, because you have Poilievre, who's been framed pretty consistently as a populist, right? And we've just finished discussing how populists are pretty much the epitome of all evil socio-political ideology, right? And Bernier has been framed as something even worse than that. So he's a little bit out of the question, I think, for at least the next few voting cycles. I think, unfortunately, Canadians really do desire a change in conservative policies, but they want them to come from Carney for some reason, and so they've doomed themselves. I think a really telling statistic is that I think 43% of the Canadian youth is actually in favor of annexation by the United States of America. And so basically anybody in Canada who has a need for hope or a future has deemed it not to reside in Canada and to instead kind of be elsewhere, let's say, at the very least, right, in America perhaps. And so at least that next election cycle doesn't look great in terms of rectifying things and maybe moving a little bit more towards the right. In terms of Alberta seceding or something like that with a Carney prime minister, I perhaps, but it would be a very long and drawn out process because of the amount of legislation that the prime minister, never mind somebody like Carney, would be able to leverage in order to stall and waylay that process. Like, for instance, those War Measures Act, the War Measures Act that Trudeau himself used against the truckers.
Well, and again, I would do this just to make you laugh. I think we say with virtual certainty that Canada's not going to be the 51st state of the United States. So, again, there are some interesting things. We're going to be watching that election up there as well. But in some respects, brings us back to our final point, and that is what your piece is a call for the press to treat it fairly. And I guess that's maybe asking too much. It might be a heavy lift right now for the establishment media. But I certainly know that what we try to do on this program is give a more accurate presentation. And it does seem to me that once you start labeling individuals who are populist as evil, it then justifies almost anything. And if at least the mainstream media, the legacy media, could back off on some of that, maybe some of the political violence we've seen might back off as well. So I appreciate you writing the article. I appreciate you joining with us. And we do have a Millennial Roundtable where others that are contributors to our Young Voices participate. And I hope maybe you can participate with us sometime in the future.
Oh, I'd love to. That sounds great. Let me know whenever it is, and I'm there.
We're going to take a break, but I thought I'd leave just enough time to mention that if you're not already taking action, we do have a take action item for you. It's in the middle section here. Stop illegal immigrants from voting in federal elections. You've heard me talk about this before. I sent an email out the other day that gave more information. It has to do with the SAVE Act. Stands for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. It has already passed the House of Representatives and has gone on to the Senate. So we give you some basic information about that. We have a suggested letter that you can send to your 2 United States senators. All you'll need to do is maybe edit it in any way that you would want to do so it becomes yours. Fill out the contact information if you've not used our contact information recently, because we have a new system, so it might require you to fill it out again. Once you do that, then there's an opportunity for you to then either send it, or maybe if you want to, print it out and mail it, or just even to preview it and look at it one more time before you send it. And we've made it very easy for you to take action. And again, I'm going to alert you because maybe tomorrow we'll keep it, but by next week we're going to go on to another very important issue that you need to contact your members of Congress about. So take action right now. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America.
Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about mistakes that sometimes newspapers or news magazines make. And in some respects, it really gives you a perspective on their worldview. And the first one, which I was going to ignore, but finally there's been so much said about it, it's worth mentioning: Christianity Today. Now, if you're not familiar, if those of you that get any kind of subscription to the Babylon Bee or to a variety of news outlets, probably are well aware that Christianity Today, which, by the way, was founded by the late Billy Graham. The first editor was Carl F.H. Henry, who I, of course, not only studied, but I was fortunate when I was at Georgetown University to get to know him pretty well and went to his home a number of times and all of that. But nevertheless, here is an evangelical magazine that has all of a sudden not become quite so evangelical. And there's kind of no news about that, but they're one that certainly sort of struck everybody as completely out of the character of what you would expect, was an article that came out from Christianity Today. Was Jesus crucified with nails? And the argument is that maybe he wasn't actually nailed to the cross at Calvary, but he was just tied there with ropes. Now, you don't even know how to respond to that. But nevertheless, let's get into it for a little bit, because it might tell you maybe the inner workings of what's going on there as well. Because you have the individual that was writing this and had seen something that looked kind of intriguing about how maybe this wasn't the case. It, of course, if you think about it, was going right against everything we have. Not the least of which is, let's just take Thomas. Remember, Thomas said, look, I am not going to believe that Jesus rose from the dead until what? I think any school child, any kid in kindergarten, Sunday school could tell you what that is, until I see what? The nails in his hand. Okay, the Greek word actually refers to iron spikes or nails, not ropes. And so as a result, you've had a number of people, and I'll read this piece quickly from Dr. Jeremiah Johnston of Christian Thinkers Society and others. If you're not familiar, he's been traveling around recently, of course, talking about the resurrection, because that is his most recent book. He was on with our friend Michael Knowles talking about this, and there's one point where he even hands him, first of all, some of those spikes that were used, as well as, interestingly enough, the crown of thorns and a number of others. You can watch that. And again, as he points out, this article was Jesus crucified with nails. He says, shockingly, the article disregards direct and explicit biblical testimony, not the least of which we have. Of course, we've also have one of the archaeological findings, which sometimes I show when I speak to a group, about the heel bone that was pierced with a nail. They couldn't get it out, so this individual, and you find in one of the ossuaries, still has the nail in it. And so Anyway, you can go on and on. But, of course, now this has led to Megan Basham and others saying, well, how did this even happen? This is Christianity Today putting out something that maybe you might expect from, I don't know, Newsweek magazine or Time magazine. They always love to have something coming out at Christmas or Easter to seemingly attempt to try to question the historical narrative of the Bible. But this is an organization that is very different. And so now she has wanted to hold responsible not only the person that wrote the article, but it would be the senior editor of the magazine, and that's somebody we've had on the program. And so you start realizing that there's just a lot of things going on that make you really become even a little bit more skeptical about what was oftentimes considered the evangelical journal of record, and it is no more. So again, we'll get into some of that maybe in the future, but I just thought I would at least mention that because it did come out. And that's a good setup for the other one by Ingrid Jock. And she wrote this one in USA Today, and it has to do with the fact that after Bill Maher, the atheist comedian, spent some time with President Donald Trump and then talked about it on his HBO show, well, then that led Larry, who is involved with writing about a number of things, Larry David, who is known probably best for Seinfeld and probably second best for Curb Your Enthusiasm. And so he put together a piece in which it was kind of satire, mocking his fictional dinner with Adolf Hitler. And, of course, as Ingrid points out, Democrats and the Hollywood elite for years have reveled in comparing Trump to Hitler. So the concept is nothing new. But the links to which Larry David went, she says, and then putting it on the platform of the New York Times, giving it perhaps more credibility than it deserved, once again illustrates the case. And so to explain the decision, the deputy editor of the New York Times, that'd be Patrick Healy, said, well, Larry's piece is not equating Trump with Hitler. It's about seeing people for who they really are and not losing sight of that. Sometimes the best way to make an opinion argument isn't in a traditional essay. Americans are inundated with news. It can sometimes take a satirical provocation to break through, even at the risk of causing offense. And that's when Ingrid Jacques said, talk about gaslighting at its worst. David didn't just mock Bill Maher's decision to have dinner with Trump. The point of his piece is that Trump is so awful and it's so morally repugnant to meet our nation's president. It would be similar to dining with Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany. And she says it's insulting for the Times to try to paint the essay as anything other than an attempt to then paint Trump as Hitler. But then all goes on to even say that the point makes even further, because if indeed you are arguing that there really is no distinguishing feature between Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump, then what about the 77 million Americans who voted for him? And again, she said, when I first read David's piece, the first thing I thought was the reaction to a very different piece published in 2020, and that was by, again, an individual we quoted recently, Senator Tom Cotton, who is a Republican senator from Arkansas, in which he penned a piece equating the sending in of the military to help cities deal with violent riots as something, again, that is out of maybe the Third Reich. And you can just have this double standard, as she points out, where on the one hand we can mock even people like Bill Maher, who's an atheist and a liberal, and we can mock Donald Trump, and we can mock millions of Americans, but we can then at the very end say, well, it was just a provocative piece that the New York Times thought was a good piece to publish. In both cases, I think of both, whether it's Christianity Today or the New York Times, you learned a little bit about the worldview of the people deciding what you see, read, and hear. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
16 years ago, I wrote the book Making the Most of Your Money on Tough Times, and I tried to cover all the important issues connected with money, including a chapter on materialism and consumerism. But it didn't occur to me to write about the group of Americans now referred to as the Henrys. According to an article in the Wall Street Journal, many Americans qualify as Henry, which stands for high earner, not rich yet. These are people who have incomes in the hundreds of thousands who still are living paycheck to paycheck. These Henrys describe feeling stuck on a hamster wheel, a nice one that other hamsters envy, but running in place nonetheless. Of course, the natural reaction is, you're asking me to feel sympathy for Audi driving, Chase Sapphire loving, Whole Foods shopping consultant types with kids in private school? Well, maybe not. But Henrys represent at the high end what most Americans are feeling. This is the growing gap between what you have and what you feel you need to be comfortable. Their anxiety illustrates two theological principles. First, most Americans lack contentment. Paul explained that he has learned in whatever situation I am to be content. We are seeking happiness, which is often elusive. Our discontentment arises from trying to fill a God-shaped vacuum in our soul with material goods. Second, this discontentment is connected to a lack of meaning and identity. We need purpose, or more accurately, we need to follow God's calling in our lives. Paul said he was going to press on towards the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Too many Americans are looking for meaning, identity, and happiness in the wrong places and need to find contentment. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on a biblical view on big data, go to viewpoints.info/data. That's viewpoints.info/data.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, we were supposed to have this hour Lathan Watts. He had some other things he needed to do, but it turns out that even though he's not here, one of the articles I posted, and hopefully it will be posted soon, is about the issue of education freedom meeting religious freedom, and it really goes back to the conversation we had yesterday about this case that appeared before the Supreme Court. The oral arguments in Mahmoud versus Taylor is going to probably be a very significant victory for parental rights and for religious liberty. So we'll get into that. And actually, Star Parker has written this piece, and it's a reminder that as she says, there were two important developments in the area of education, especially public education, that occurred over the last week. One was a sign of the problem we have. The other was a sign of the solution. So let's talk about the problem. And what she's talking about, of course, is this case that went before the Supreme Court. She said the court has just heard this case in which families from a variety of faiths, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, are fighting the imposition by the Board of Education in Montgomery County, Maryland, to have children learn material about gender ideology. I think she softened it, but we've talked about what some of that entailed, and I'll get into that in just a minute if we need to. And the schools have about 20 books that are part of the curriculum that champion, as it says, pride parades, gender transition, pronoun preferences for children. We're talking about, she says, material that seeks to legitimize the notion of gender ambiguity and transgenderism. And she says, not surprisingly, the religious parents have objected and requested the opportunity to pull their kids from the sessions when this material is taught. Now, according to the Beckett Fund, though, The parents were simply asking to be notified when the books will be read to their children and be given an opportunity to opt out. The school board rejected this. As I pointed out yesterday, one of the reasons they rejected it is because too many parents wanted to opt their kids out. And it would be a little embarrassing if when you're going to have the so-called English reading of a particular passage having to do with, the girl that wanted to be a boy? Even in kindergarten, they had the pride puppy goes to a pride parade or something like that. If all of a sudden you only have 3 kids sitting in the classroom, that doesn't look good for the school district. So they said, well, we can't let you opt out. She doesn't talk about that, but we learned that from some of the back and forth in the oral arguments the other day. Anyway, going back to Star Parker, she says the school board rejected this request and insisted that they cannot notify parents and allow the children to skip the sessions. Hence the lawsuit, she says, in which the parents claim, according to the Beckett Fund, that the board is violating the parents' inalienable and constitutionally protected right to control the religious upbringing of their children, especially on sensitive issues concerning family life and human sexuality. Now, again, the buzzword, she says, that defines the mindset of those insisting on forcing this material as part of the school curriculum is what? Inclusion. And again, according to one blogger at the National Women's Law Center, this is a case that goes far beyond legal arguments in the heart of what it means to build inclusive, affirming public schools, particularly for LGBTQIA plus students. It is barely comprehensible that so many, including those with power in the Montgomery Board of Education, were so totally lost the meaning of religious freedom. Inclusiveness in America means that we're all included under our constitutional protection to practice one's religion as they see fit. It does not mean that a bureaucrat or anyone else decides what is right and just for everyone and coerces all to accept their worldview. As George Washington, she points out, wrote in a famous letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, then a tiny minority in the country in 1790, this is what George Washington wrote, quote, "For happily the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, no persecution, no assistance, requires only that they live under its protection, shall determine themselves as good citizens, in giving in on all occasions that effectual support. Everyone should sit in safety under their own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid," unquote. By the way, that phrase about sitting under our own vine and fig tree is one that was the case of a book that I think we talked about years ago here on Point of View. So the point she's making is this has to do with religious freedom. And there was, I think, a real deliberate attempt by the Justice Jackson, Ketanji Brown Jackson, to try to muddle that because she used a couple of analogies. And maybe tomorrow, when we do have 2 lawyers in studio, that would be Jeff Mateer and Keisha Russell, I want to get their questions about these analogies that were used in the Supreme Court. Because Justice Jackson, for example, asked whether it would be coercive for a gay teacher to have a wedding photo on his or her desk, completely, of course, as the argument that we quoted yesterday by Dan McLaughlin, missing the point that a school's mandatory curriculum is very different than a photo that she might have on her desk. And as I jokingly pointed out yesterday, I want to get the reaction from some of them around the table. Yes, it's okay to have a photo that shows same sex, but apparently it's not okay to have a crucifix because, at least in Connecticut, that will get you fired if you're not careful. And so the other question that Justice Jackson asked is whether if a student group put up, for example, a Love is Love poster, whether that would be a problem. And again, as Dan McLaughlin points out, ignoring a distinction between the free speech of a student versus a teacher-led classroom curriculum, which you are not allowed to opt out of. And the argument being made, I think, was even hard for anybody to take it seriously, but nevertheless, these arguments being made by her and by one or two of the other particular individuals. Sonia Sotomayor, for example, was arguing, and Ketanji Brown Jackson were arguing, well, yes, just because they teach that doesn't mean the students have to accept it. Well, it comes from a teacher talking about that in the first place, and I think it looks pretty mandatory. Well, anyway, the first part of Star Parker's article, which we'll see if we can get posted by the end of the day, talks first about development in terms of this issue of sex education. But the second one has to do with a possible solution, and that's where she then focuses her time and attention on the state of Texas. And she points out that Texas is on the verge of enacting one of the nation's most far-reaching school choice programs. It passed the Texas State House, a $1 billion allocation for vouchers for parental choice. Now they have to work out some things in the conference committee. Provides, as she points out, up to $10,000 per student, $30,000 for those with disabilities, $2,000 for homeschoolers, and special consideration in allocation of vouchers will be given to children with low-income households and those with disabilities. Meanwhile, federal legislation has been introduced to provide a $10 billion tax credit for contributions to nonprofits that offer private education. And she says today, religious freedom and education freedom are becoming one in the same. As an individual that's been looking at the plight of the schools, especially in low-income areas, being African-American herself and at one point being on welfare, she sees some of these as positive changes. And so, again, I wanted you to be able to at least read this article, because whether you hear about it from the Beckett Fund or yesterday from the article by Dan McLaughlin or the article today by Star Parker, I think a lot of people believe this Supreme Court case is going to be a very important case, and we'll probably talk about it again tomorrow, and then I'm sure we'll talk about it quite a bit when I predict the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the parents and against the Montgomery County Board of Education. But we'll see where that goes. Let's take a break. I've got more to cover, quite a bit more to cover, and we may not get to all of it today. And that is fine, because we will have an opportunity tomorrow to cover some of that as well. But let me just mention that we still have our Take Action item up there. And if you've already done the Take Action item, then I'll point you to my Viewpoints commentary, because after the break, I'll talk about that briefly before we get into some other issues. But I did want to mention that if you are an individual that is sort of waiting until you get around to it, well, you may be able to get around to it today. I suspect maybe we'll still post it tomorrow. But by next week, we're going to be moving on, because there are other issues. And you've heard me say it before. It's one thing to have an executive order. It's quite another to have a law. It's one thing to talk about some of the things we need to do to make sure that only citizens vote. It's quite another to have a law that makes sure that takes place. So that's why we recognize that this has already passed the House of Representatives. It's now before the Senate. It's an opportunity for you to contact your 2 United States senators about this issue. So if you haven't taken the time to visit the website, let me encourage you to do so. If you haven't contacted your 2 senators, do your civic duty. And we'll have more right after this.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you. Now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if I can, real quickly talk about the particular commentary that I have here. And it relates a little bit to some of the conversation we've already had about the population crisis and the jobs issues and all the rest. It's on the other end of the spectrum, if you will, politically and economically, but it's, again, a very relevant issue. And that is, as I point out, about 16 years ago, I wrote a book called Making the Most of Your Money in Tough Times, and it's a book we still make available because the tough times we had back then in 2008, we sort of have them again. So it's one of those perennial books. And I tried to cover everything from the desire for young people to go towards a socialist point of view to I had chapters on materialism and consumerism, but I didn't have a chapter on the Henrys. Of course, that's a relatively new acronym, but if you're not familiar with that, Wall Street Journal says that a Henry are those individuals, and it uses the acronym high earner, not rich yet. These are people with very substantial incomes, sometimes in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, who are still living paycheck to paycheck. We can kind of see where I'm probably going with this because, first of all, some of these Henrys describe themselves as feeling stuck on a hamster wheel, a nice one that other hamsters might envy, but running in place nevertheless. And so, of course, the natural reaction, and this was in the Wall Street Journal article, you're asking me to feel sympathy for an Audi driving, Chase Sapphire loving, Whole Foods shopping consultant types with kids in private school. It's kind of a tongue twister, but nevertheless, at least once I got it off on our commentary. But again, that's kind of where we are. Maybe not. But I think it illustrates that whether you're at the top end of the income spectrum or at the bottom end, maybe you've paid your taxes now and you're hoping for that tax refund to show up. Maybe you're just trying to say, how can I just make it through the end of this month? There are all sorts of questions that people are asking. And so in some respects, it really does illustrate the gap between what you have and what you feel you need to be comfortable. Now, there's two aspects of that. First of all, especially for people in the lower end, I've tried to point out so many times, and I've quoted all sorts of individuals, some who would agree with us theologically, some that will not, some who I would love to have on the program, but their tendency to swear would just make it too hard for Megan to try to be holding her finger over the swear button, but are certainly saying really important things. And part of that has to do with the fact that because we no longer have the dollar as good as gold, we no longer have a fixed amount for dollars. As a result, whenever there's a crisis, and we're about ready to hit another one, which I'll talk about in just a minute, we just print more money. And so as a result, when you print more money, the money in your pocketbook, the money in your wallet, the money in your 401k, which is now looking like a 201k, that's a joke, or whatever it might be, is less. And so the people that have invested that in any kind of assets, that's stock market, houses, whatever, they many times are able to sort of keep level with inflation and with dollar devaluation. The rest find themselves not able to survive. And so it's, I think, a truism that unless we can turn some of this around, and there are answers to that, but you have to admit there's a problem before you can come up with a solution, then we are going to continue to see a greater and growing wage gap. And the solution is not to make Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez the president and vice president. Socialism is the way to equalize income, but only by having everybody be poor. That doesn't work. And we have tried this more than 24 times in other countries and know that does not work. So part of the problem is real. The other part of the problem is manufactured, and that's where my commentary, if I might rejoin it, talks about the fact that most Americans lack contentment. You think about Paul in Philippians chapter 4, that he says, I have learned to be content in whatever situation I am in. And in some respects, the idea of learn to be content shows it's not a natural phenomenon. It's something that is learned, and he had to learn that himself. And so I think sometimes you have Americans, especially since they've turned away from God, they've turned away from the church, turned away from kind of core values that would give you meaning in life. And so they're seeking happiness, but they're finding that that's pretty elusive. They're trying to fill up, I think, a God-shaped vacuum in their lives with material goods, and they don't have enough of them, and they're just assuming that if they can just get just a little bit more money, just get a little bit more land, get a better house, get a nicer car, they'll feel happy, and they find out that really doesn't work. The other is, of course, this discontentment that I think comes from a lack of meaning in identity. If we don't have God's calling in our lives, that's important as well. And so I just quoted from Philippians 4. Let's go left in Philippians 3. Here you see Paul talking about pressing on towards the goal of the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. And that's the importance of calling as well. And so I think it is important to recognize that we are living in a time where even though from a worldly point of view, we're doing better than ever, I will admit that those dollars that we have now in our pockets aren't worth what they were years ago. But on paper, it looks like we're doing really well as a country in terms of GDP. We look like we're doing pretty well in terms of the income we're receiving. You wouldn't notice that, though, if you also looked at the amount of indebtedness, but I think it is really a reminder of some of the frustration that people are having, and of course that is the commentary for today. So if you'd like to read it or pass it on to others, let me encourage you to do so. Just before we take a break, though, one of the things I've talked about here is what I call DDT. That is Doge, deportations, and tariffs. And I might even make it DDDT because the other D is DEI, and we're seeing that right now with Harvard. But one of the things that I was really struck by is a piece by David Marcus that came out in which he said America owes Elon Musk after Doge. He says, as Elon Musk prepares to step back from his service in the Trump administration, which I'd heard rumors of, but I guess that's now the case, the nation owes him a debt of gratitude for breaking through decades of empty promises about exposing and ending waste. And so one of the things that they've said is that Musk shared on Tuesday that his time focused on the Department of Government Efficiency, Doge, would drop significantly as he moves to refocus on his businesses. And, of course, you know the price that he's had to pay in order to do that. Certainly, his service with Doge has hurt the Tesla electric car company, and he also needs to focus some time on other ventures like SpaceX. But it isn't the loss of income that seems to have affected him the worst. It's the fact that he has been so vilified. And as David Marcus points out, Elon Musk is a person who likes to be liked. He's playful. He likes to make jokes. With bright, wide eyes, he invites everyone into his extraordinary mind to explore getting to Mars or saving the planet or the implications of artificial intelligence or low birth rates, which we talked about earlier. But now millions of Americans hate him. And he says, David Marcus says, as strange as sympathy for the wealthiest man to ever live might seem, no amount of money can purchase respect or glowing legacy, both of which Musk has risked, and in the case of liberal opinions, sacrificed, at least for now. And so he points out that in some respects, Elon Musk has served as, and I love this illustration, a heat shield, kind of calling back to SpaceX, or a lightning rod through some of Trump's tumultuous and historical first 100 days. And again, if you look at some of those protests, he has become, sadly, public enemy number one. Do we like everything he's done? No. Do we like everything he's said? Were there mistakes made? Probably. I'm sure we could document those for some time. But here is an individual that could have just simply said long ago, I am the richest man in the world. I can just go off and play and never get involved in trying to solve problems in, for example, electric cars, in space travel, or even decide to volunteer and be the head of the Department of Government Efficiency and sometimes sleeping on a couch in the executive office building so that he can be there in Washington, D.C. to do a job that so few people wanted to do because it's a thankless job indeed. So I thought as we maybe see Elon Musk stepping out of that role, maybe some of us need to at least say, thank you for giving it a good try. Let's take a break. We got more to cover right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and of course tomorrow we're going to spend some time in our weekend edition. Going to be a great opportunity to talk with Keisha Russell, who of course is the author of this very good book on courage, and we'll talk about that probably a little bit. We'll certainly talk with Jeff Mateer about some of the cases there for First Liberty, and of course we welcome your phone calls there as well. Just before we wind down today, I talked about Elon Musk, but the greatest number of critics of him have come from primarily the Democratic Party. And so I thought for just a minute I would talk about what I think is a growing split in terms of where this party is going. I think it is important to always have at least a two-party system. I wish we had a multi-party system. That would probably be better for a lot of things, but we are pretty much with a two-party system, and there's always checks and balances, even within the political realm. But right now you have some real differences, and I'm going to quote first from Rebecca Downs, giving us some background on Gavin Newsom and how he's really kind of changed what he's saying. And, of course, don't forget that he's obviously running for the presidency. We wonder about whether or not Senator Chris Van Hollen, who's the senator from Maryland who went down to El Salvador to be with Mr. Garcia, whether or not he might want to run for national office as well. And contrast that with a piece that I posted a few days ago called The New Democratic Divide by Harold Meyerson. He is obviously much more in favor of the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So you get kind of a twofer here. First of all, Rebecca Downs says, Gavin Newsom, who is term limited and cannot run for re-election in California, is almost certainly running for president in 2028. I don't think that's a big surprise, but now you know. Then one of these articles that appeared in The Hill, California Governor Gavin Newsom is accusing the Democratic Party of not yet performing a thorough autopsy on what went wrong in its devastating loss in the White House and then Senate majority in November. This was a sit-down interview he did with The Hill, which is, of course, the journal of record for Congress. And Gavin Newsom said, let me quote him, "We have not done a forensic of what just went wrong, period, full stop." Goes on to say, I know it. I mean, to the extent that I'm marginally part of this party, I represent the state larger than 21 state populations combined, and I can assure you there's not a party discussion that I'm aware of that has included the state of California. I don't know what the party is. I'm still struggling with that. So those are some of his comments. Now, why does he point that out? Well, he's looking at numbers as well. Gavin Newsom may actually govern one of the more blue states, but the country did see a shift to the right, even in states like Washington State. And even if you look at the Biden-Harris ticket that won California in 2020 with 63% of the vote, the Harris-Walz ticket won with just 58%. So that's a dropout there. And we are starting to see that a more progressive wing, dark woke, we were talking about this the other day, that's, of course, Representative Jasmine Crockett. Or let me now come to this other article that we posted a few days ago by Harold Meyerson, in which he says the Democratic brand of economic populism, not to be confused with the conversation we had with William Barclay. He says, first of all, best exemplifies what is happening with the fact that right now Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are kind of on a tour. It's the anti-oligarch, anti-Trump tour that is actually running across the nation. And what he says that Bernie and AOC actually advocate is a form of social democracy that encompasses a public provision for health care, child care, senior care, and higher education, and that a cause that most Americans, he says, support in part but not in full. And again, recognize he's writing as an individual very sympathetic to these ideas from a Democratic point of view, but he recognizes this is the case. He then quotes a survey, which I just found in his article, which was interesting. This poll was done by Survey USA, and that poll found that 50% of Democrats wanted the party to become more progressive, while just 18% wanted it to become more moderate. This is not the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton, not even close. Pollsters usually don't unpack terms, he says, like progressive, liberal, moderate, and conservative to denote whether they refer to economic beliefs or cultural beliefs. But he says, my hunch is that most of the respondents who answered more progressive had in mind in this poll was an economic policy, while most of those who answered more moderate had in mind cultural policy. But also, I suspect most of those who answered more progressive also meant more openly resistant to Trump and more committed to building resistance to Trump. Hence the argument we talked about the other day of dark woke. And that is, I think, best illustrated by some of the kinds of things that the Jasmine Crockett's and the AOCs and the squad are doing. And so that is the case. He then goes on to say that Bernie Sanders' bet is that there are a lot of middle class and working class voters in some of these states whose anti-oligarch sentiments inflamed by the elevation of Elon Musk, see, we're back to Elon Musk, to the role of retirement and health care benefit slasher, provide Democrats with a deeper and more durable way to win those majorities. You might at this point say, well, why are you talking about this? The presidential election is years away. Yes, but the midterms are already progressing right now. If you are already watching television, you may have already seen some ads. Now, they're not ads officially that I'm running as a candidate, but you're seeing these ads right now that are promoting something that your member of Congress might be doing because he or she is thinking about running for the Senate. You might see some wonderful kinds of newsletters showing up in your mailbox from your senator because that senator is indeed ready to maybe run for the presidency. Even as I mentioned just a minute ago, when you're talking about Senator Chris Van Hollen, there was a person I met with today, and he was talking about the fact that I don't even understand why he's going to El Salvador, but he says, well, I recognize because there's TV cameras there. And you've heard this before. One of the most dangerous places in the world is between a presidential candidate and some TV cameras, and I suspect that he is running as well. So whether it's Gavin Newsom or a variety of others, some are saying, you know what, we need to maybe moderate, and Gavin Newsom has his own podcast. He was bringing some conservative guests on, including Charlie Kirk, which was interesting, and meeting with even Bill Maher, who's obviously not a conservative, but certainly open to changing the tone and message of Democrats. And so that's kind of one strand that is working its way out and maybe even is going to be significant in these midterm elections. And then, of course, the other more progressive wing, as illustrated by the anti-oligarch, anti-Trump particular parade across the country by Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So we'll see how that plays out, but it's an interesting look at what is happening kind of behind the scenes. And, of course, we'll be watching that with some regularity, and perhaps even tomorrow we'll get some comments from around the table with our two guests. One last time, let me just mention my Viewpoints commentary is there for you to read. And also, if you haven't taken the time to sign up, just click that button that says Read Now, and there's a section that says Never Miss a Viewpoint. Sign up here. And most importantly, if you haven't taken action, we have a Take Action item there for you as well. Many of the articles by everything from William Barclay to Tom Knighton, as well as Star Parker, available on our website, or hopefully by the end of the day will be on the website, and you can read those at your leisure. I want to thank Megan for her help behind the scenes, engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. See you back here tomorrow on Point of View.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.